The scorching Texas sun beat down on the weathered wooden porch of the Henderson homestead, where 20-year-old Clara May sat alone, watching her family prepare for yet another gathering she wouldn't truly be part of. The year was 1884, and in the small town of Cedar Ridge, being different meant being forgotten. Inside the modest farmhouse, her mother Sarah bustled about, setting the table for Sunday dinner. Clara May could see through the window as her three brothers, James, Thomas, and young Billy, helped arrange chairs, their mouths moving in animated conversation she could never hear. The vibrations of their laughter reached her through the floorboards, but the words, the jokes, the warmth of inclusion remained forever beyond her reach. Her father, Ezra Henderson, emerged from the barn, dust covering his worn overalls. He glanced at Clara May with that familiar expression, a mixture of pity and resignation that had become as constant as the Texas heat. When neighbors arrived for dinner, she watched him gesture toward her with apologetic shrugs, as if explaining away a broken piece of furniture. "She can't hear nothing," she could read from his lips, when he thought she wasn't looking. "Born that way. Ain't much use for ranch work neither." Clara May had learned to read lips out of necessity, a skill that often revealed more than she wished to know. During family meals, conversations flowed around her like water around a stone. Her brothers discussed cattle prices, weather patterns, and town gossip while she sat silent, occasionally receiving a pat on the head or a sympathetic smile, gestures that felt more like dismissals than affection. The isolation was suffocating. In a world where communication meant survival, where knowing when a storm was coming or cattle were in distress could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, Clara May was seen as a liability. Her family had long ago stopped trying to include her in meaningful ways, instead treating her like a child despite her 20 years. As the sun began to set, painting the endless Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara May made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't bear another evening of sitting at the periphery of her own life. Slipping away from the house, she walked toward the vast pastures that stretched beyond their property line, seeking solace in the only place where her silence felt natural, the open range, the encounter. When silence speaks louder than words. The morning dew still clung to the prairie grass when Clara May found herself at the edge of the Whitmore Ranch, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. She had walked for hours, her worn boots carrying her far from the suffocating atmosphere of home. Here beside a weathered fence post, she sat watching the sunrise paint the endless Texas landscape in golden hues. Samuel Whitmore, known throughout the region as the Cattle Baron, had built his empire through shrewd business sense and an understanding of both land and livestock that bordered on intuitive. At 45, his weathered face told stories of countless seasons under the unforgiving Texas sun, but his eyes held a kindness that his reputation for toughness often overshadowed. He was riding his morning rounds when he spotted the young woman sitting alone by his fence. Something about her posture, straight-backed despite her obvious distress, dignified even in her isolation, caught his attention. As he approached on horseback, he noticed she didn't turn at the sound of hoofbeats, didn't acknowledge his presence until his shadow fell across her. When Clara May finally looked up, Samuel saw something that stopped him cold. Her eyes held a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young, yet they also carried a weight of loneliness that struck him to his core. She didn't speak, didn't call out or explain her presence on his land. Instead, she simply looked at him with a directness that was both challenging and vulnerable. Samuel dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had dealt with enough spooked cattle to understand that sudden movements could send anyone running. As he approached, he noticed how Clara May's eyes tracked his lips when he spoke, how she tilted her head slightly as if trying to catch sounds that would never come. "You're Ezra Henderson's daughter," he said, more statement than question. He had seen her in town, always trailing behind her family like an afterthought. "Clara May, isn't it?" She nodded, surprised that he knew her name. Most people in Cedar Ridge knew of her, the deaf girl from the Henderson place, but few bothered to learn who she actually was. Samuel crouched down to her level, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "You're a long way from home," he observed, his voice gentle. "Everything all right?" Clara May's response came not in words but in the subtle shift of her expression, a tightening around her eyes that spoke of years of accumulated hurt. Samuel, who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of distressed animals, recognized pain when he saw it. "You know," he said, settling onto the grass beside her, "I've always found that the best conversations happen without words anyway." He gestured toward his vast herds grazing in the distance. "Cattle don't talk much either, but they've got plenty to say if you know how to listen." For the first time in years, Clara May felt seen rather than simply observed. This powerful man, whose word carried weight throughout the county, was choosing to sit in the dirt beside her, speaking to her as if her silence was a choice rather than a limitation. As they sat together watching the cattle move across the pasture, Samuel began to point out different animals, describing their personalities and quirks through gestures and expressions that Clara May could easily follow. A large bull with a distinctive white patch became Old Stubborn, while a cow who always wandered off was the Explorer. When the sun reached its peak, Samuel stood and extended his hand to Clara May. "Would you like to see how we really talk to cattle?" he asked. "I have a feeling you might have a natural talent for it." Finding her voice, the language of understanding. The Whitmore Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, but it was in the modest ranch house kitchen where Clara May's real education began. Samuel had brought her home that first day, much to the surprise of his longtime housekeeper Maria Santos, a warm Mexican woman who had worked for the Whitmore family for over 2 decades. "Señor Samuel," Maria said, her accented English mixing with rapid Spanish as she gestured toward Clara May. "Who is this niña?" Samuel explained the situation in his characteristic straightforward manner. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, Maria. She needs to learn that there's more than one way to communicate in this world." Maria, who had raised 5 children of her own, immediately understood what Samuel was truly offering. Not just shelter, but belonging. Within hours, she had Clara May helping in the kitchen, teaching her through demonstration and patience the rhythms of ranch life. The transformation began slowly. Samuel spent his evenings after long days managing cattle and ranch hands, sitting with Clara May at the kitchen table, developing a system of hand signals that went far beyond the basic gestures she had known. Each sign was practical, rooted in the daily needs of ranch life. A closed fist meant stop, an open palm meant come. Fingers pointed skyward indicated storm coming, while a sweeping motion across the throat meant danger. But Samuel went further, creating signs for emotions, for thoughts, for the subtle communications that make relationships possible. "Happy," he would sign, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile as he touched his heart and then opened his hands skyward. "Sad" came with a downward motion and a gentle frown. "Proud" involved standing tall with hands on hips, while "grateful" was expressed by placing both hands over the heart and bowing slightly. Clara May absorbed these lessons with an eagerness that surprised even Samuel. Her natural intelligence, suppressed for so long by her family's low expectations, flourished under his patient instruction. Within weeks, she was not only communicating complex ideas but also developing her own variations and improvements to their growing sign vocabulary. The real breakthrough came when Samuel introduced her to the cattle. Standing at the edge of a large pasture, he showed her how to read the subtle signs that indicated the herd's mood and intentions. A cow's ear position, the way they grouped together, the speed of their movements. All of these told stories that Clara May, freed from the distraction of sound, could read with remarkable clarity. "Watch that heifer there," Samuel signed, pointing to a young cow standing apart from the group. "What do you see?" Clara May studied the animal carefully, noting its posture, the way it kept looking toward the barn, the restless shifting of its weight. Her hands moved in response. Sick, wants help, scared. Samuel's eyes widened in amazement. The heifer had indeed been showing early signs of illness that even his experienced ranch hands had missed. Clara May's ability to focus entirely on visual cues, unencumbered by the noise and distraction that others experienced, gave her an almost supernatural ability to understand animal behavior. Word of her talent spread quickly among the ranch hands. Miguel Restrepo, the head foreman, initially skeptical of having the deaf girl around the cattle, soon became one of her strongest advocates after she correctly predicted a stampede 2 days before it happened, simply by reading the subtle signs of agitation in the herd. "Dios mío," Miguel muttered to Samuel after Clara May had successfully calmed a spooked horse using nothing but patient gestures and steady presence. "She speaks their language better than we do." As autumn arrived, Clara May had found not just a home, but a purpose. The ranch hands, initially uncertain how to interact with her, now sought her opinion on difficult animals. Maria had taught her to cook traditional Mexican dishes, communicating recipes through demonstration and shared laughter, and Samuel had given her something she had never experienced before: respect for her abilities rather than pity for her limitations. But the greatest gift was yet to come. As Clara May grew more confident in her new environment, she began to realize that her silence was not an absence of voice, but a different kind of voice altogether, one that spoke through action, understanding, and a deep connection to the world around her. The storm and the test. When actions speak louder than words. The late October sky hung heavy and ominous over the Whitmore Ranch, pregnant with the kind of storm that could devastate a cattle operation in a matter of hours. The barometric pressure had been dropping for days, and even the most experienced ranch hands could feel the electricity building in the air. Clara May had been sensing the approaching danger for nearly a week. The cattle had been restless, clustering together in unusual patterns, their ears constantly twitching toward the horizon. She had tried to communicate her concerns to Samuel through their established sign language, but the urgency she felt was difficult to convey. "Big storm," she signed repeatedly, her hands moving with increasing agitation. "Cattle scared, very scared." Samuel, while trusting Clara May's instincts more than anyone else's, was caught between her warnings and the practical needs of the ranch. They had nearly 3,000 head of cattle spread across multiple pastures, and moving them all based on what others might see as the intuition of a deaf girl was a massive undertaking. The crisis came to a head on a Tuesday morning when Jake Morrison, Samuel's most experienced ranch hand, rode in with troubling news. "Boss, we got problems. That new herd we brought in from San Antonio, they're spooked about something. Been pacing the fence line all night." Clara May, who had been helping Maria prepare lunch, immediately set down her work and moved to the window. Even from the house, she could see the telltale signs she had been warning about for days. The cattle weren't just restless, they were terrified. Without waiting for permission, Clara May ran toward the stables. Samuel, recognizing the urgency in her movements, followed quickly behind. As they reached the pasture where the new cattle were kept, the full scope of the problem became clear. The herd was pressed against the far fence, their eyes wide with panic, their bodies trembling with an energy that spoke of imminent flight. Clara May approached the fence slowly, her movements deliberate and calming. As she drew closer, she could see what the others had missed: the subtle signs that indicated these cattle were on the verge of a massive stampede. "They're going to run," Clara May signed frantically to Samuel. "Tonight, when storm comes, they'll run straight through town." Samuel felt his blood run cold. A stampede of 3,000 cattle through Cedar Ridge would be catastrophic. The town sat directly in the path the cattle would take if they broke through the eastern fence, and with families, children, and elderly residents in their path, the loss of life could be enormous. "How long do we have?" Samuel signed back. Clara May studied the sky, the cattle, the way the wind was beginning to shift. Her answer came in quick, precise gestures. "Few hours, maybe less." What followed was the most intense afternoon of Samuel's ranching career. With Clara May serving as his eyes and ears among the cattle, they orchestrated a massive relocation effort. Every available ranch hand was called in, and Clara May positioned herself at strategic points around the herd, using her unique ability to read cattle behavior to guide the movement. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Spooked cattle are unpredictable, and moving them requires a delicate balance of pressure and patience. But Clara May's presence had a calming effect that amazed everyone involved. She seemed to communicate with the animals on a level that transcended normal human-animal interaction. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the last of the cattle were secured in a protected valley several miles from town. The ranch hands, exhausted but relieved, gathered in the ranch house as the storm finally broke with full fury. Thunder crashed overhead, lightning illuminated the prairie in stark, dramatic flashes, and rain fell in torrents that would have made movement impossible just hours earlier. Through it all, Clara May sat by the window, watching the storm with a satisfaction that came from knowing her voice, silent though it was, had been heard when it mattered most. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived the next morning with news that confirmed everyone's fears. "Found evidence of what would have been a massive stampede," he reported to Samuel. "Fence posts were already starting to give way. If those cattle had run—" He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Miguel Restrepo, who had initially been skeptical of Clara May's abilities, approached her with something approaching reverence. "You saved the town," he said, his words translated into sign language by Samuel. "You saved all of us." But it was Samuel's response that meant the most to Clara May. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the storm-cleared sky in brilliant colors, he turned to her with an expression of deep respect. "You found your voice," he signed. "And when you spoke, the whole world listened. The voice that changed everything. Home is where you're heard." 6 months had passed since the storm, and the Whitmore Ranch had become more than Clara May's home. It had become the place where she discovered who she truly was. The spring of 1885 brought new life to the Texas prairie, and with it, a confidence in Clara May that radiated from her every gesture. The transformation was remarkable. The timid, overlooked girl who had once sat silent at her family's table had become an integral part of one of the most successful ranching operations in Texas. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads would specifically request Clara May's input when dealing with difficult animals, and her reputation as a cattle whisperer had spread throughout the county. But the most significant change was in Clara May herself. She carried herself differently now, shoulders back, head high, eyes bright with purpose. The sign language she and Samuel had developed had evolved into something beautiful and complex, allowing for conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions about life, dreams, and the future. The test of how far she had come arrived unexpectedly on a warm April morning when her brother James Henderson rode up to the ranch house. Clara May was in the corral, working with a young horse that had been resistant to training. When she saw him approaching, James dismounted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with his mission. He had always been the most sympathetic of her brothers, but even his kindness had been tinged with the same pity that characterized her family's treatment of her. "Clara May," he called out, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone she remembered so well. "Pa sent me to fetch you home. Ma's been worried sick, and the whole family thinks it's time you stopped playing around and came back where you belong." Clara May straightened slowly, her hands moving in fluid gestures that James couldn't understand. Samuel, who had been watching from the porch, approached to serve as translator, but Clara May held up a hand to stop him. She had something to say, and she wanted to say it herself. Moving to the fence rail, Clara May picked up a piece of charcoal and a board that the ranch hands used for keeping tallies. In clear, precise handwriting, she wrote, "I am not playing. This is my life, my work, my home. I belong here." James read the words with growing confusion. "Clara May, you can't just run off and live with strangers. You're family. You belong with us." Clara May wrote again, "Family is not about blood. It's about being seen, being heard, being valued. Here, I have a voice." "But you can't even talk," James protested, his frustration evident. It was then that Samuel stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate respect. "Your sister communicates more clearly than most people who can hear," he said firmly. "She's saved this ranch more times than I can count, and she's earned the respect of every person who works here." To demonstrate his point, Samuel called out to Miguel, who was working nearby. "Miguel, tell Mr. Henderson what Clara May did last week with the sick calf." Miguel approached with obvious pride in his voice. "Your sister, she saw that the calf was sick before any of us. She knew exactly what was wrong and how to help. The veterinarian said later that if we had waited even one more day, we would have lost the animal." James looked from Miguel to Samuel to his sister, clearly struggling to reconcile this image of Clara May as a valued contributor with his memories of the silent, overlooked girl from home. Clara May wrote one more message, her handwriting firm and confident. "I was never broken. I was just never given the chance to show what I could do." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. James gradually began to understand that Clara May's deafness had never been the real problem. It was her family's inability to see past it that had created the isolation she had endured for 20 years. When Ezra Henderson himself arrived 2 days later, clearly prepared for a confrontation, he found something he hadn't expected. His daughter was not the helpless girl he remembered, but a confident young woman who had found her place in the world. The meeting between father and daughter took place in Samuel's study, with Samuel serving as translator. Ezra's initial demands that Clara May return home gradually gave way to amazement as he learned about her accomplishments at the ranch. "She really does all this?" Ezra asked Samuel, his voice filled with wonder. "Reading the cattle, predicting storms, training horses?" "She does more than that," Samuel replied. "She's taught all of us that there are many ways to communicate, many ways to contribute. Your daughter has a gift, Mr. Henderson. She always did. She just needed someone to recognize it." The conversation ended with Ezra making an offer that surprised everyone, including Clara May. Would you consider coming home sometimes? Maybe teaching us some of those hand signals? Your mother, she's been learning to write more. Thinking maybe we could." Clara May's response was gracious but firm. She would visit, she would maintain her relationship with her family, but her home was now at the Whitmore Ranch. She had found her voice here, and she wouldn't give it up. As autumn arrived again, marking a full year since Clara May had first encountered Samuel by the fence post, the ranch celebrated its most successful year ever. The cattle were healthy, the profits were strong, and the operation ran with an efficiency that other ranchers envied. But for Clara May, the greatest success was personal. She had proven that being different didn't mean being less than, that silence could speak volumes, and that every person, regardless of their limitations, had something valuable to contribute to the world. Standing on the porch of the ranch house as the sun set over the endless Texas prairie, Clara May reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the lonely girl who had once sat at the edge of her family's gatherings, feeling invisible and unwanted. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who had found her voice, and who had learned that home wasn't a place. It was wherever you were truly heard and valued for who you are. Samuel joined her on the porch, and together they watched the cattle moving peacefully across the pasture. No words were needed, spoken or signed. In the comfortable silence they shared, Clara May had found something more precious than sound. She had found understanding, respect, and a love that needed no voice to be heard. The story of the deaf girl who became the voice of the Whitmore Ranch would be told for generations, inspiring others to look beyond limitations and see the extraordinary potential that exists in every human heart.